carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and the corn.
Welcome back to the Virginia History Podcast. In the last episode, I detailed very briefly just a little bit about Sir Walter Raleigh's life. Working from that foundation, let's take a look at the first colonization attempt in the Virginia region. After Humphrey Gilbert's untimely death in 1583, Walter Raleigh picked up the mantle and used his new position at court to continue encouraging overseas exploration, especially with the mindset that Spanish Catholicism needed to be crushed, if not in Europe, at least in the New World. To get the ball rolling, Walter Raleigh converted his new gift from the Queen, Durham House, into a sort of maritime college. The biggest English maritime names to that time, such as John Dee, both the elder and younger Richard Hakluyt, Philip Amadas, and Arthur Barlow, met at Raleigh's home in 1583 to 1584, as they were all involved in Virginia's planning stages. After approximately 6 months' deliberation, an information-gathering excursion into Virginia was organized. Raleigh and his group wanted to know as much as they possibly could about the world they were to explore before committing to a more permanent situation. In order to do so, they hired the Portuguese master pilot Simon Fernandez, who had extensive Atlantic sailing experience, Thomas Harriot, a scientist, and John White, an artist who would become key to each Roanoke expedition. None of the men were novices. Simon Fernandez's resume was spectacular. He was born and raised in the Azores, a Portuguese possession, moved to Sevilla, Spain, to undergo more extensive navigational training, and began piloting for the Spanish crown in the 1560s. Soon, however, Fernandez broke with his employers, took up English residence, and became a pirate, preying upon Spanish vessels in the 1570s. Yet piracy was illegal in England during this time, which meant that after Fernandez was captured by the English in 1577, he was sentenced to be hanged. But before he was to be executed, however, another of Elizabeth's favorites, the spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham, saved the one-time pirate, because Walsingham aptly perceived Fernandez's value as a potential tool against the Spanish overseas monopoly. Thomas Harriot had extensively studied astronomy and applied that study to geography and navigation. His work eventually crossed paths with the already well-established John Dee, who introduced Harriot to Raleigh, who along with his gaggle were greatly impressed by Harriot's intelligence. As a result of his notable brilliance, Harriot began teaching and training the soon-to-be colonizers. Finally, John White had also served on at least one overseas venture. He was the hired artist for Martin Frobisher's disastrous 1577 voyage to what is today Baffin Island. It is possible that White's work from that expedition crossed Raleigh's focus through the Frenchman Jacques Lemoyne, a survivor of the Fort Caroline massacre, which made White hot property. No one can really know for sure about how White came into contact with Raleigh, as not much is known about White before the 1570s, or for that matter after the 1590s. But Lemoyne's artistic work and opinion was greatly respected by Raleigh, so if Lemoyne had shown some of White's Newfoundland work, Raleigh would have certainly taken notice. Once the team was assembled, they chose the Outer Banks region, largely because of Simon Fernandez's urging, who had served and explored the region possibly during the Ayacán debacle under the Spanish governor Pedro Menendez. Planning and dreaming about the expedition eventually became reality in April 1584, when Elizabeth bestowed her royal approval upon the venture, and 2 ships, loaded with provisions for approximately 80 men, disembarked from Plymouth, England for the New World. After leaving Plymouth, the voyage took a southerly course toward the West Indies via the Canary Islands in May 1584, before arriving in Puerto Rico a month later for a 2-week resupplying stop in June 1584. By early July, the ships were sailing along the Outer Banks of North Carolina, where they skirted the coast looking for an opening. After looking for 100 miles, Fernandez piloted the ships into the Pamlico Sound and anchored at Hatteras Island. The crew rowed ashore, and in typical English fashion, the group led by Amadas and Barlow proclaimed the land in the name of the Queen during a formal assembly. The territory was now officially part of England, and their exploration began in earnest. For the first 3 days, the English observed and recorded everything they could see in the region. They noted such animals as herons, deer, rabbits, many other wild birds, and many trees such as cedars, pine, cypress, and most valuably sassafras, which was believed to be a cure for syphilis, that seems to have plagued at least courtly England during this time. On the 4th day, 3 Native Americans approached the Englishmen, and pleasantries were exchanged. after which one of the Indians was brought aboard to tour one of the English ships, where he received various English goods like a shirt and a hat, much to his delight. Intrigued by this encounter, the next day the Secotan Indians sent upwards of 40 or more men, including Granganameo, their chief, to meet with the English on Hatteras Island. Friendly relations were established, and what seems to have been favorable trade between the peoples occurred. For a few weeks, friendly relations like these continued, much to the delight of both sides, which led the English to believe that all of the surrounding natives were as friendly as Granganameo's Secotan tribe. Based upon that belief, the English then began to expand their exploration outward from Hatteras Island. At Granganameo's invitation, they journeyed northward to the chief's Roanoke Island, where the reception was not as welcoming as was hoped. In fact, their arrival was greeted by a horrible cry of distress, only later quelled by English gifts being shown to the frightened natives. Regardless of the outcome, the instance was a bad omen of things to come. After Amadas and Fernandez left Roanoke, they sailed further northward along the Albemarle Sound, where according to their report many English were killed by hostile natives, thus forcing the exploring crew to retreat. A valuable lesson was learned. Not all Indians were friendly. No one really knows why the English were attacked, but at least one theory seems plausible, notably that Granganameo's tribe was at war with a northern tribe, perhaps the Weapemiocs. Whether or not this was the case, it appears that the encounter soured Amadas and Barlow to some extent, because only 6 weeks after laying anchor near Hatteras Island, the captains were ready to leave Virginia. Before departing Virginia, however, the English traded 2 of their crew for 2 Indians, a Croatoan named Manteo and a Secotan named Wanchese, who were to sail back to England with the English. Along with the Indians, the English had their own fascinating accounts to report, which captured English imagination, though it was Manteo and Wanchese who must have added to the English excitement by detailing treasures of gold and silver, which they said were to be found further inland. That being the case, the English had to return, and a second expedition had to be funded, so thought Raleigh's influential group. To raise the necessary funds, Raleigh's group went into overdrive. Both of the Richard Hacklights again began writing about New World benefits to English prominence and wealth. Meanwhile, Thomas Harriot taught the Indians English in order for them to be shown at Elizabeth's court, and White's paintings were scattered abroad as a sort of New World advertising campaign. But nothing aided Raleigh's ambition as much as deteriorating relations with Spain in the 1580s. Because of these failing relations, English colonization in the New World became a matter of English defense against the Catholic Spanish. Sure, gold and silver were still in the minds of Englishmen, but establishing an English colony in what was to that point the Spanish New World would only aid in taking Spanish gold while destroying Spanish might and securing Protestantism in England. Such an outpost would certainly aid Raleigh's cousin, the increasingly famous Francis Drake's work. Furthermore, Raleigh gained an ally in Francis Walsingham, who dusted off Gilbert and Raleigh's plans to send English ships into the Newfoundland region to be used against the Spanish. Even with such support and public approval, Raleigh had to work through Parliament to achieve his ultimate goals, and his bill to raise funds for continued Virginia exploration was accepted in the House of Commons, but only there. The House of Lords rejected it. Raleigh's work was over, or at least it appeared that way, until Raleigh turned on his charm and further wooed Elizabeth, who, after enduring a few weeks of Raleigh's loving advances, knighted her favorite, gave Raleigh permission to undertake a second expedition, though with one hitch, that Raleigh was to establish a colony or lose all claims in the region, and bestowed upon Raleigh the title of Lord and Governor of Virginia. After the English Christmas festivities were completed, plans were set in motion for his second adventure, though the first truly serious attempt at colonizing Virginia, which will be the subject of our next podcast. Thank you for your continued interest in Virginia's history. For more information about this and other topics covered during the podcast, please visit our website at vahistorypodcast.com or the podcast's Facebook page. Finally, if you haven't already done so, please locate the podcast on your favorite podcasting service and subscribe. I look forward to resuming the podcast with the 1585 Roanoke expedition after the New Year. Until then, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Mas tudo bate despedido dos embazes.